The city woke up the same way it always did, with gray light creeping over rooftops and the smell of rain still lingering from the night before. But for Kofi, mornings had a rhythm that had nothing to do with the weather. He rose before dawn in his small, tidy house on the edge of the city, made tea for his mother, checked that her medication was set out properly on the kitchen table, and left before the sun fully rose to begin his work as a private driver for one of the wealthiest men in the country. Few people who saw him in his simple gray uniform, holding open the door of a gleaming black car, could have imagined that 15 years earlier, this same quiet man had built one of the most respected architecture and construction empires the country had ever known, working under the name Mr. K, a name spoken with something close to reverence in boardrooms he no longer visited. He had walked away from all of it, from the wealth, the meetings, the applause, the moment his mother fell seriously ill, choosing without hesitation to care for the woman who had raised him from nothing. And in the years since, he had found a strange peace in being invisible, in being underestimated, in being nothing more to the world than a driver who opened doors and carried bags. He never regretted it. But he had also never imagined that the company he built with his own hands would one day fall into the grip of a man like David. David was young, sharp-suited, and utterly convinced of his own brilliance, though anyone who knew the history of the company understood that he had simply been the right relative in the right place when the previous chief executive stepped down unexpectedly, leaving David to occupy the interim seat with a confidence that had never been tested by real hardship. He had grown up in comfort, educated at expensive schools where professors rarely challenged the assumptions of students whose family names appeared on donor plaques in the hallways, and he had entered the corporate world believing that intelligence and entitlement were the same thing. He had never once worked a job that required him to stand outside in bad weather, never once been dismissed by someone in a position of power simply because of how he looked or spoke. And this absence of hardship had left him with a peculiar blindness, an inability to imagine that the people who served him each day might carry histories, talents, or dignity worth considering at all. He mistook his own comfort for evidence of his superiority, and he mistook the quiet patience of people like Kofi for proof that they had nothing better to offer the world. He believed that money was the only language worth speaking, that kindness was a weakness reserved for people who could not afford ambition, and that the world existed to serve his comfort. That morning, as Kofi drove him through the rain-slicked streets toward the office, David scrolled through a tablet full of budget projections with the restless energy of a man rearranging other people's futures without a second thought. He was cutting the funding for the Sunrise Housing Project, a development meant to give hundreds of poor families safe, affordable homes, slashing the steel reinforcement budget in half and eliminating the drainage systems entirely, calling the decision efficient, calling it smart, calling it necessary for the company's profit margins. Kofi listened in silence for as long as he could bear it, watching the wipers sweep across the windshield before he finally spoke. "Sir, forgive me for saying so," he said carefully, glancing at David through the rearview mirror. "But those homes are meant for families with children. If the reinforcement is weakened and the heavy rains come, as they do every year in that region, the consequences could be severe." David did not even look up from his tablet. "Since when does a driver understand construction, Kofi?" he said, his voice slicing through the hum of the engine with practiced disdain. "You open doors. You carry my bags. You clean up my mess when I spill my coffee. That is the complete and total measure of your importance to this company. Do you understand me?" Kofi said nothing for a long moment, his hands steady on the wheel, his jaw tightening only slightly, betraying nothing else. "I understand, sir," he finally answered, and in the calm of his voice there was something David would never recognize. Not weakness, but the quiet discipline of a man who had once carried burdens far heavier than insults, a man who had built entire buildings from nothing and had learned, long ago, That dignity was not something other people could take from you unless you allowed it. Good, David said, satisfied, returning his attention to the numbers on his screen. Now hurry, the board is waiting, and I will not tolerate being made to look unprepared because of traffic. Kofi guided the car through the crowded streets, past vendors setting up their stalls beneath plastic sheeting to keep the goods dry, past children running to school with their bags held over their heads against the rain, past the very neighborhoods where, 15 years earlier, he had walked with rolled-up blueprints under his arm, dreaming of buildings that would rise not as monuments to wealth but as shelters for people who had never been given a fair chance at safety or comfort. He remembered those early years vividly, the long nights spent designing structures that could withstand flooding, the arguments he had won against skeptical investors who believed that safety features were an unnecessary expense, the quiet satisfaction of watching the very first sunrise housing block completed, its walls solid, its foundations deep, families moving in with tears of gratitude in their eyes. He had built that legacy stone by stone, contract by contract, refusing every temptation to cut corners, even when it would have made him richer far sooner. And then, without warning or ceremony, his mother's illness had arrived, sudden and frightening, and he had walked away from everything without a moment's hesitation, understanding instinctively that no title, no fortune, no legacy mattered more than the woman who had given him his life. He had left the company in careful hands, believing it would continue along the path he had built for it. He had not anticipated a man like David inheriting that path and treating it as nothing more than a ladder to personal comfort. The illness that had called him away all those years ago had arrived quietly, the way serious things often do, beginning with small fatigue his mother dismissed as nothing more than age, until a routine visit to the doctor revealed a diagnosis that changed everything in a single afternoon. Kofi remembered sitting beside her in the small clinic waiting room, holding her hand as the doctor explained treatment options, remembered the way she had squeezed his fingers and told him, with more strength than he felt himself, that she refused to let fear control either of their lives. He had resigned from the company the very next week, ignoring the shocked protests of his board, the disbelief of investors who could not understand why a man at the height of his success would simply walk away, and the quiet, persistent doubts of his own mind that occasionally wondered whether he was making a terrible mistake. But watching her recover slowly over the following months, present for every appointment, every difficult night, every small victory, along the road to stability, he had never once regretted the decision, understanding with complete clarity that no boardroom triumph could ever replace the quiet privilege of caring for the person who had once cared so completely for him. When they finally arrived at the towering glass headquarters of the company, David stepped out of the car with his usual air of self-importance, handing Kofi a paper cup of coffee to hold. A moment later, without explanation, he declared that he no longer wanted it and ordered Kofi to drop it onto the pavement. It was a small, deliberate cruelty, chosen the way a man chooses to step on an insect simply because he can. A quiet reminder of exactly where David believed Kofi belonged in the order of the world. Kofi knelt without complaint and wiped the spilled coffee from the concrete, while David straightened his jacket nearby, feeling powerful in the smallness of another man's humiliation, unaware that the driver kneeling before him had once signed contracts worth more money than David would likely earn in his entire lifetime. Inside the building, a very different kind of storm was waiting for David. Amina, the chairperson of the board and the company's majority shareholder, stood near the elevators with the composed authority of a woman who had spent decades earning her position through wisdom rather than inheritance. She did not raise her voice when she spoke, but the entire lobby seemed to quiet itself around her presence. "David," she said, "the international investors have raised a concern that cannot be ignored any longer. They want confirmation that the founder of this company's architecture division still stands behind the direction we are taking. They want to know the truth about Mr. K." David felt something cold settle beneath his tailored suit, though he fought to keep his expression composed. "Mr. K disappeared more than 15 years ago, Amina," he said. "He is practically a legend at this point, a story we tell new employees. Nobody has seen him since?" "Then find him," Amina said, her tone leaving no room for argument, "or find solid, undeniable proof of what became of him. The board will not accept silence at the design summit. You have until then, David. Do not fail me." David swallowed hard, nodding stiffly before retreating toward the elevators, his mind racing through possibilities, none of which came close to the truth, standing quietly behind him in a driver's uniform, wiping the last traces of spilled coffee from his hands. In the weeks that followed, the humiliations continued, each one small enough to be dismissed by anyone watching, yet heavy enough to remind Kofi exactly how little David thought of him. He was made to stand outside in the rain while David finished long lunches with business partners. He was scolded for arriving 1 minute early, then scolded again for arriving 1 minute late. He watched, quietly, as decisions were made that stripped safety measures from projects meant to protect vulnerable families, as budgets were slashed not out of necessity but out of greed, dressed up as strategy. He said nothing, not out of fear, but out of patience. The same patience that had once allowed him to build an empire from nothing, brick by brick, contract by contract, without ever needing to raise his voice to prove his worth. One of the younger employees at the company, a junior architect named Afua, who had joined the firm fresh out of university, often found herself quietly grateful for Kofi's presence in the parking garage each evening. While David barked orders and Linda sneered at anyone she considered beneath her, Kofi always remembered to ask about Afua's designs, offering small observations about load-bearing walls or drainage angles that, though she did not know it, came from a mind far more experienced than her professors had ever been. She once mentioned, laughing, that he spoke about buildings the way most men spoke about their children, and Kofi had simply smiled and said that perhaps, in a way, he did. She never suspected the truth, but she often told her colleagues that the driver in the parking garage seemed to understand the company's buildings better than half the executives on the top floor, a comment that was repeated in hushed amusement among the staff, none of them imagining how close to reality her joke actually was. It was during this time that David's fiancée, Linda, became a regular presence at the office, and her cruelty toward Kofi rivaled David's own. She arrived one afternoon dressed in imported fashion, dragging several heavy shopping bags that she dropped carelessly at Kofi's feet without so much as glancing in his direction. "Carry these to David's office," she said, already scrolling through her phone, "and please try not to smell like the parking garage this time." "Of course, ma'am," Kofi replied, lifting the bags with the same quiet composure he carried everywhere. A composure that had once negotiated deals worth millions of dollars. A composure that now made Linda roll her eyes in open contempt. "Honestly, I don't know how David tolerates people like you around all day," she said, walking briskly past him as though he were nothing more than a piece of furniture that happened to move. "Everybody is somebody, ma'am," Kofi said softly without anger. "Even the ones who carry the bags." Linda did not bother to respond. She simply laughed, a cold, hollow sound, and disappeared into David's office, unaware that the beginning of her own downfall was quietly taking root in that very same building. Linda had grown up believing that appearances were the only currency that truly mattered, raised in a household where her mother measured success by the labels sewn into a dress and the address printed on a wedding invitation. She had met David at a charity gala 2 years earlier, drawn less to his personality than to the title he carried, and the doors it promised to open for her, and she had spent every month since carefully positioning herself as the future face of a company she privately believed she deserved to help control. The flagship project represented to her not merely an opportunity for quiet theft, but a kind of insurance policy, a guarantee that whatever happened to her relationship with David, she would walk away with enough resources to maintain the lifestyle she considered her birthright. She had convinced herself, over many quiet conversations with Junior, that the scheme carried no real risk, that the people running the company were too distracted, too trusting, or too incompetent to ever notice a well-disguised percentage buried within thousands of line items. She had never once considered that the greatest threat to her plan wore a driver's uniform and said very little, precisely because she had never considered him worth noticing at all. It happened almost by accident. Linda had left her phone behind on David's desk, the screen still glowing from an open conversation, and Kofi, passing through to collect empty coffee cups, could not help but see the words displayed clearly on the screen. It was a message exchanged with a rival contractor, discussing in plain, careless detail how they intended to inflate the invoices of the company's upcoming flagship project by 30%, splitting the stolen funds 3 ways. Confident that David would never scrutinize the numbers closely enough to notice the deception hidden within them, Kofi felt something cold settle deep in his chest as he read the words a second time, to be certain he had understood correctly. This was no longer simple arrogance or careless spending. This was theft, deliberate and calculated, aimed directly at the pockets of the very families the flagship project was meant to serve. Families who had already waited years for safe and affordable homes. When Linda returned moments later and found him standing near her phone, her expression twisted instantly from confusion into fury. "How much did you see?" she demanded, snatching the phone from the desk. "Enough to understand that the project, meant to build homes for families, is being turned into an act of theft," Kofi answered evenly, his voice steady despite the weight of what he had just discovered. Linda's fear quickly hardened into something far crueler. She stepped closer, lowering her voice into a venomous whisper. "Listen carefully, driver. If you say one single word about this to David, to the board, to anyone at all, I will make one phone call, and your mother will lose her nursing position at Central Hospital by the end of the week. I have friends there. I can end her career before you even finish your next sentence." Kofi looked at her for a long, quiet moment, and in his eyes there was neither fear nor hatred, only a calm, unshakable resolve that unsettled her more than any argument could have. "You believe that threatening a sick, hard-working woman makes you powerful," he said softly. "It only proves to me exactly how small you really are." He said nothing further. He did not report her to David. He did not warn the board. Instead, he made a quiet decision to watch patiently, as Linda and her accomplices marched confidently toward the very trap they were building for themselves, entirely unaware that the humble driver they mocked so freely held more knowledge, more history, and more quiet power than either of them could possibly imagine. The weeks passed in a strange, tense calm. David grew increasingly anxious as the design summit approached, his searches for any trace of Mr. K turning up nothing but old rumors and dead ends, each failure sharpening his temper and deepening his cruelty toward Kofi, whom he blamed, absurdly, for every inconvenience in his life, as though the driver's silence itself was somehow an insult directed at him personally. Kofi endured it all without complaint, spending his evenings at his mother's bedside, reading to her from old newspapers, adjusting her blankets, listening to her stories of his childhood, never once mentioning the storm quietly building behind the walls of the company that still, unknowingly, bore the fingerprints of his own genius in every foundation, every archway, every carefully engineered structure that had made it famous. In his private office late one night, long after most of the staff had gone home, David sat alone, surrounded by old company archives, flipping through yellowed photographs and outdated blueprints in a desperate search for any trace of the elusive founder. He found grainy images of groundbreaking ceremonies from decades earlier, men in hard hats shaking hands beside freshly poured foundations, but never a clear photograph of the man himself, as though Mr. K had deliberately ensured his own face would never become the story. David found old memos praising the founder's insistence on flood-resistant design, his refusal to compromise on worker safety even when investors demanded faster timelines, his quiet habit of visiting construction sites personally to speak with laborers rather than simply reviewing reports from a comfortable office. Reading those memos, David felt an unfamiliar and unwelcome sensation stirring somewhere beneath his frustration, something uncomfortably close to shame, though he quickly buried it beneath irritation at the impossibility of his task. He slammed the folder shut, poured himself a drink, and told himself that whoever this Mr. K had been, the man was clearly gone for good. A ghost story useful only for impressing nervous investors, never once suspecting that the true answer to his search had driven him home from that very office only hours earlier, waited patiently outside in the rain, and wished him a quiet, respectful good night before disappearing into the dark streets toward a modest house where an aging mother waited for her tea. Meanwhile, the rival contractor working alongside Linda, a nervous, ambitious man named Junior who had spent years building smaller projects while resenting the larger firms that dominated every major contract, grew increasingly uneasy about the scheme he had agreed to. He met Linda late one evening in a quiet restaurant far from the office, his hands trembling slightly around his glass. "If this is discovered," he said, "we will lose everything, not just the money." "Nothing will be discovered," Linda replied coolly, sipping her wine as though discussing nothing more serious than wedding invitations. "David signs whatever I place in front of him. The board trusts him blindly. And the only person who might have noticed anything is a driver who values his mother's job far too much to risk it." Junior nodded slowly, though the uneasy feeling in his stomach did not fully disappear. He did not know, as he raised his glass to seal their arrangement, that the very driver Linda dismissed so easily had already begun quietly gathering his own understanding of the fraud, taking shape around him, patient and watchful, waiting for the precise moment when silence would no longer serve justice. Amina herself had not always been the composed, unshakable figure the company now depended on. She had joined the board decades earlier as one of its only female members, fighting for every ounce of respect in rooms filled with men who assumed her opinions carried less weight than her signature on their paperwork. She had watched the company's founder, the mysterious Mr. K, build something extraordinary from nothing, and though she had never learned his true identity, she had admired the quiet integrity behind every decision he made, the way profit never once overruled the safety of the people the company was meant to serve. When David rose to power, she had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that some of that integrity might still linger in the halls he now occupied. It took less than a year for her hope to curdle into suspicion, and less than 2 for suspicion to harden into quiet, careful vigilance. She began keeping her own records of every questionable decision David made, every safety measure quietly removed from a budget, every excuse offered in place of accountability, waiting patiently for the moment when the evidence would finally be undeniable. She did not yet know that the final piece of that evidence would arrive not through her own investigation, but through the calm, steady hands of a man everyone else in the building had dismissed as unworthy of notice. The night before the summit, Kofi sat beside his mother's bed longer than usual, the small lamp on her nightstand casting a warm glow across the room. She had noticed, in the way mothers always notice, that something weighed heavily on her son's mind, and she asked him gently what troubled him. "Tomorrow," Kofi said quietly, "I may have to become someone I put away a long time ago, someone I was not sure I would ever need to become again." His mother studied his face for a long moment before speaking. "You were never someone else, Kofi. You simply chose, for a time, to let the world see only the smaller part of who you are. If tomorrow requires the rest of you to step forward, then let it step forward. Hiding was never your purpose. It was only ever your patience." Kofi held her hand in the quiet room, feeling the truth of her words settle over him, like a familiar weight finally set down after a long journey. He kissed her forehead, promised to visit as soon as the summit concluded, and walked out into the cool night air feeling, for the first time in many years, entirely ready to be seen. Finally, the day of the Global Design and Housing Summit arrived, filling a grand ballroom with international investors, journalists, and cameras, eager to capture the signing of what David and Linda had promised would be the company's most ambitious flagship project yet. Golden lights spilled from enormous chandeliers overhead, catching the polished marble floors and the crystal glasses of champagne carried by silent waiters, weaving between clusters of powerful men and women exchanging polite, calculated conversation. Banners bearing the company's logo hung from the ceiling beside those of the summit's international sponsors, and a live orchestra played softly near the entrance, lending the entire event an atmosphere of celebration, entirely unaware of the reckoning quietly approaching its center stage. David stood on the stage beside Linda, both dressed in their finest, radiating the confidence of people who believed they had already won, while Amina watched from the front row, arms crossed, her patience for David's excuses finally exhausted entirely. "Ladies and gentlemen," David announced into the microphone, his voice smooth and rehearsed, "thank you for joining us at this year's Global Design and Housing Summit. Today we sign a contract that will define the future of this company, a flagship project built on trust, innovation, and excellence." Before the contract could be brought forward, Amina rose slightly in her seat. "Before that happens, David," she said loud enough for those nearby to hear, "I still expect an answer about Mr. K." David forced a confident smile, though sweat had already begun forming at his temples. "Amina, we are still searching, but I assure you, the strength of this contract speaks for itself." "Strength without honesty is just noise, David," she replied coldly. It was at that exact moment that David spotted Kofi entering quietly from the back of the grand ballroom, dressed simply, his presence rippling through the crowd like a stone dropped into still water. Something inside David, threatened by a presence he could not fully explain, snapped instantly. "Security!" he barked into the microphone, his voice cracking with sudden panic disguised as authority. "Remove this man immediately. He is my driver, not a guest at this event." Guards seized Kofi's arms without hesitation, dragging him back toward the entrance as phones rose throughout the crowd to capture the humiliating spectacle. David laughed loudly into the microphone, delighting openly in the moment, telling the stunned onlookers to forgive the confusion caused by, in his words, people who wander in where they clearly do not belong. It was Amina who rose first, her voice cutting through the enormous hall like a clap of thunder. "Security, release him, now." She walked briskly onto the stage and took the microphone directly from David's trembling hand, her expression unwavering. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice steady, commanding, and impossible to ignore, "allow me to correct a very serious mistake happening in front of you at this very moment. This man, the one you just watched being dragged out of this room like a common intruder, is not a driver. This is Mr. K, the true founder of this company and the architect behind everything you see standing proudly around us today." The enormous room fell into stunned silence for a heartbeat before erupting into gasps, whispers, and a storm of camera flashes. David's face drained of every trace of color. "That's impossible," he stammered, his voice barely audible. "He opens my car door every single morning." "He opened your car door," Amina replied coldly, "because he chose humility over recognition, David, something you have never once understood in your entire life." Kofi walked calmly onto the stage, accepting the microphone with steady hands. He spoke of building the company's foundation many years earlier with nothing but ambition and skill, of stepping away not out of weakness, but out of love for his ailing mother, and of returning now only because the very mission he had built with his own hands was under attack from within its own walls. He raised a folder of documents, instantly projected onto the massive screen towering behind him, revealing line by line the fraudulent invoices, the inflated percentages, and the private messages exchanged between Linda and her rival contractor, laid bare for every investor, journalist, and camera in the room to witness. A murmur rippled through the crowd as the numbers appeared clearly on the screen, investors leaning toward one another in hushed disbelief, journalists scribbling furiously in their notebooks, their cameras flashing in rapid succession to capture every second of the unraveling scandal. One of the international investors, a stern older man who had flown in specifically to finalize the flagship contract, rose from his seat and asked loudly whether the board had been aware of these discrepancies before today. Amina answered without hesitation that she had not, that the fraud had been uncovered entirely through the diligence of the very man David had just attempted to have thrown out of the building, a statement that drew gasps and, moments later, a slow ripple of applause that grew louder with every passing second. Linda's confidence shattered instantly into open panic. She gripped David's arm, hissing at him to do something, to say something, anything at all. But there was nothing left worth saying. The evidence spoke plainly for itself, undeniable, complete, and utterly damning. "You knew," Linda whispered, staring at Kofi in disbelief, her voice trembling. "You knew this whole time." "I knew the moment you threatened an innocent woman's job simply to buy my silence," Kofi answered calmly. Police officers entered the grand hall moments later, and Amina ordered them forward without a flicker of hesitation. David begged desperately, his voice cracking as he appealed to reputations and legacies that no longer meant anything to anyone in that room. Amina's response was swift and final. "You built nothing, David. You only borrowed what a far better man had already created, and then tried, foolishly, to destroy it." As David and Linda were led away in complete disgrace, marched past the very same aisle where Kofi had been dragged out only minutes earlier, the roles between them had reversed entirely and irreversibly. The very crowd that had laughed carelessly at his humiliation now rose together in respectful, thunderous applause for the quiet man who had endured so much without ever once losing his dignity. He looked out across the enormous room, at the faces still processing the sudden reversal of everything they had believed only minutes earlier, and he spoke plainly, without theatrics, the way he had always preferred to speak. He told them that a company's true strength was never measured in the size of its contracts or the polish of its summits, but in the safety of the walls it built and the honesty of the hands that built them. He told them that he had watched quietly for months as decisions were made that placed profit above the well-being of families who had trusted the company with their futures, and that he had chosen patience over panic, because justice delayed, in his experience, was rarely justice denied, only justice waiting for its proper moment to arrive undeniably. He promised the investors watching him that the flagship contract would proceed, but rebuilt entirely from its foundation upward, with independent audits, transparent budgets, and a permanent commitment to the safety standards the company had nearly abandoned. The applause that followed was not the polite, obligatory applause of a business summit, but something warmer, more human, the sound of a room recognizing, perhaps for the first time that day, what genuine integrity looked like standing quietly at a podium. In the days that followed, David and Linda faced the full and unrelenting weight of the law. Investigators uncovered months of careful planning behind their scheme, including recorded threats Linda had made against Kofi's mother, threats that only deepened the severity of the charges brought against her. Junior, the rival contractor, was arrested within hours of the summit's collapse, and faced with overwhelming evidence laid out plainly before him, He confessed everything almost immediately, naming Linda as the one who had approached him first, months earlier, unraveling whatever fragile loyalty had once existed between the conspirators. He told investigators of the quiet restaurant meeting, of Linda's cold confidence, of every detail she had once believed would never see the light of day. When the case reached the courtroom, David sat pale and diminished beside his lawyer, a shadow of the man who had once laughed so easily at another person's humiliation. Linda, for her part, tried desperately to shift the blame entirely onto David, insisting through gritted teeth that she had merely followed his instructions, though the recorded threats against Kofi's mother made such a defense impossible to sustain before the judge. Amina attended every session, sitting quietly in the gallery, not out of vengeance but out of a firm belief that the company's survivors deserved to see justice carried through completely, from the ballroom stage to the final verdict. When the sentence was finally read, stripping both David and Linda of their assets and their freedom for years to come, David turned once, briefly, toward the gallery, searching for Kofi's face among the crowd, but found only Amina's steady, unwavering gaze staring back at him, offering neither pity nor triumph. Only the quiet certainty of consequences finally arrived. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered in a dense crowd, shouting questions toward the armored vehicle that would carry David away to begin serving his sentence. He caught, through the tinted glass, a brief glimpse of the city he had once believed belonged entirely to men like him. The glass towers, the busy streets, the ordinary people hurrying past without a second glance toward the disgraced executive being driven away in humiliation far greater than anything he had ever inflicted on the driver he once mocked so freely. Linda, in a separate vehicle, stared blankly ahead, already calculating, out of old habit, how she might rebuild some semblance of her former life once her sentence concluded, unaware that the name she had once worn so proudly would follow her, whispered and recognized, into every room she entered for years to come. David, stripped of his position and his reputation in a single afternoon, could do nothing but watch as everything he had built on borrowed foundations crumbled beneath him. Kofi visited his mother in the hospital that same week, sitting quietly beside her bed as the afternoon light filtered gently through the window. He told her everything, the years of silence, the humiliation he had endured, and the truth he had finally revealed before the entire world. She wept, not from sorrow, but from a pride so deep it filled the small hospital room entirely, reaching across the years to touch every sacrifice they had both made together. "All these years," she whispered, holding his hand tightly, "driving that man's car, carrying his bags, and you said nothing." "I wanted peace, Mama," Kofi told her gently. "I wanted to protect you and to watch quietly to make sure the company never lost its soul completely." "And did it lose its soul?" she asked softly. "Almost," Kofi admitted, "but not anymore. We take it back now, properly, together." A week after the summit, Amina invited Kofi to a quiet meeting in the same boardroom where she had once demanded David find the missing founder, though this time the tension in the room had transformed entirely into something closer to hope. She slid a folder across the table containing the board's unanimous decision to offer him the permanent chairmanship, alongside his reinstated role as founder and majority creative authority over every future project. "You could simply take the company back and walk away again," she said, watching him carefully. "No one here would blame you for choosing peace over responsibility a second time." Kofi considered her words for a long moment, looking out at the city skyline through the wide windows. "I once believed that walking away protected the people I loved," he said finally, "but watching from a distance, I learned that walking away also allows harm to continue unchecked in places I could have protected. I don't intend to make that mistake twice, Amina." "Then let us rebuild this properly," she said, extending her hand across the table. "Together. from the very foundation you first poured all those years ago." Kofi shook her hand firmly, and in that simple gesture, an entirely new chapter of the company's history quietly began, built not on the ambition of a single man, but on the shared conviction of two people who had both, in their own ways, refused to let power outweigh principle. In the months that followed, the company was rebuilt, from the ground up under Kofi's quiet, steady leadership, with Amina standing firmly beside him as chairperson, ensuring that every decision answered first to the people the company served, rather than the profits it chased. The Sunrise Housing Project rose again from its foundations, properly reinforced, properly drained, built without a single corner cut, on the safety of the families who would eventually call those walls home. Workers spoke of Kofi with a kind of quiet reverence, some of them barely believing the stories that their new chairman had once been mistaken for nothing more than a driver. On the day the first families arrived to receive the keys to their new homes, the site buzzed with an energy entirely different from the tense, hurried atmosphere of the project's earlier days. Mothers carried small bags of belongings toward doorways that had been reinforced twice over, compared to the original weakened plans. Fathers stood in quiet disbelief as engineers walked them through drainage systems designed to withstand even the heaviest seasonal rains, and children, unaware of any of the danger their new homes had narrowly avoided, simply ran and laughed across the freshly finished courtyards, delighted by the novelty of space they could finally call their own. Kofi stood at the edge of the construction site, watching children run across freshly poured concrete, their laughter rising into the open sky. He thought of all the years he had spent in silence, all the small cruelties he had endured without complaint, and he understood finally why he had chosen that long and difficult road instead of simply walking away entirely. Titles could be taken, stolen, or bought, he thought, watching the families embrace one another in the afternoon sun. But character, patience, and quiet strength could never be taken from anyone who refused to surrender them. True greatness, he had learned, was never loud. It waited patiently. It endured humiliation without losing itself completely. And when the moment finally arrived, it rose, not for revenge, but for justice, lifting with it every person who had ever been told, wrongly, that they were nothing more than the smallest part of someone else's story. Years later, long after the scandal had faded from the headlines and new buildings had risen across the city bearing the quiet, careful signature of Mr. K's renewed leadership, people still told the story of the driver who turned out to be a founder, though most had already forgotten the exact details, remembering only the shape of the lesson it left behind. Ifua, the young architect who had once joked about the driver understanding buildings better than the executives above him, now led her own design team within the company, mentored personally by Kofi, who often reminded her that the most important measurements in any project were never found on a blueprint, but in the dignity extended to the people who would eventually call that building home. Junior, having served his sentence and lost everything he once valued, wrote to Kofi from a small town far from the city, apologizing for the role he had played and asking humbly whether there might be honest work available for a man trying to rebuild his life quietly. Kofi, after long consideration, offered him a modest position on a construction crew far from any decision-making authority, but enough to allow a man who had chosen greed once to choose differently for the rest of his life. Amina remained chairperson for many more years, working alongside Kofi with the same steady partnership that had carried them both through the storm of that fateful summit. And together they built a company culture where no employee, however humble their uniform or their title, was ever dismissed as unworthy of respect. Kofi's mother lived to see 3 more housing developments completed under her son's renewed leadership, each one safer and more carefully built than the last. And she often told visitors with quiet pride that her son had once told her greatness was never loud, and that she had lived long enough to watch him prove it, over and over again, without ever once raising his voice to do so. Of David and Linda, little was heard beyond the initial reports of their conviction, though it was said quietly in certain circles that David had eventually taken work as a low-level clerk in a city far from the one where he had once commanded boardrooms, learning, perhaps for the first time in his life, what it meant to be looked past, to be spoken over, to be treated as though his presence in a room carried no weight at all. Whether the lesson ever truly reached him, no one could say for certain. Some employees who had known him during his brief reign as interim chief executive occasionally wondered aloud whether a different upbringing, one that included even a single season of hardship, might have shaped him into someone capable of recognizing dignity in people regardless of their uniform or title. Others simply shrugged and moved on with their lives, content to let the past remain the past, understanding that the company's future no longer depended on understanding David's failures, only on ensuring they were never repeated. But those who had watched the entire story unfold, from the humiliation in the rain-soaked car to the golden light of the summit stage, understood one truth clearly enough to carry it forward into their own lives: that the world often mistakes silence for weakness, arrogance for strength, and humility for foolishness, right up until the moment the truth finally stands up, speaks plainly, and refuses ever again to be dismissed.